This video is brought to you by Dashlane. Use the link down below to create a free account now. If you ask me, the coolest thing about PC gaming is its amazing number of options. If you're rich, you can play like this. If you're not, you can build a PC from trash. You can customize your games to look like this, and if you buy PC components, there are options for every element, with at least 2 companies competing on CPU or GPUs. And this is really good. Anytime only one company starts gaining too much control over one of these markets, innovations and options start to suffer. Which is why it is a bit concerning that when the time comes to pick an operating system, you can choose between Windows 10 and Windows 7. If you want to keep up with the latest stuff, you have to use Windows. And Microsoft's position as the gatekeeper opens up a ton of chilling nightmare scenarios for gaming. A lot of people became hopeful when Valve, obviously concerned about this very possibility,
This isn't working.
started putting some real weight behind Linux. While things did not evolve as fast as some expected, the progress that has been made in making Linux a mainstream option is impressive. Don't take me wrong, it is quite not there yet. If you use a low-end or entry-level hardware, the performance impact is noticeable, and the most optimal Linux distributions are a journey to install. But the progress made in the last 2 years make this worth keeping an eye on. So, given that every video and guide that I see on this topic tries gaming on very powerful equipment, I thought it would be worth asking, what is the current state of gaming in Linux on a modest PC? Will this be a valid option soon? As previously mentioned on this video, installing a very optimized Linux system can be pretty daunting, even for someone with a moderate level of tech literacy. But desktop Linux is not one monolithic entity like Windows, but rather a family of systems based on the same kernel. My favorite among them is Ubuntu, mainly because of how easy it is to install and relatively easy to get support when something does not work. Seriously, at this point I have had more failed Windows installations than failed Ubuntu installations. You will likely notice a ton of people in comments complaining about my choice of distribution. Keep in mind that Linux distros are a common source of internet fights. But I stand by what I said. From a perspective of a beginner user, Ubuntu is one of the easiest to get into. And from the perspective of a budget PC user, there's a variant called lubuntu, which is optimized to be as light as possible, which is what I will use. This thing has revived many old computers, and its background use of resources is extraordinarily low. I will focus on NVIDIA GPUs for this video, as the drivers are also the easiest to install. I am aware that there's a powerful open source AMD driver, but it is also a fair bit more complicated to install. More on that later. While installing software in Linux can be initially a bit of a daunting task if you're new to the whole thing, installing Steam is super easy. Getting the latest NVIDIA driver is a bit trickier since it involves adding a repository, which involves some terminal commands, but then there's a nice tool to select the newest driver. One thing, however, to keep in mind is that a lot of the gaming options that I'm going to discuss are pretty new, and therefore require the use of the latest drivers, which is why you will see me use an entry-level GT 1030 rather than an older gaming GPU like a 460, as I want to retain compatibility with Vulkan and newest drivers. As you will soon see, some of these methods are months old. Let's get to gaming. Part 1. Native ports. There's a surprisingly high number of native Linux ports of games available through Steam. While outside the indie realm the number of big titles tends to be small, there are a number of surprises. For example, a large quantity of Valve's own back catalog has been ported, including Counter-Strike Global Offensive. This game is a curious example, because on the benchmark map the GPU is too powerful for 720 and we hit a hard CPU bottleneck, but still has very good performance all around. Let's test another example. The open world Mad Max game, which was ported by Feral Interactive, a studio that has made a reputation out of high quality Linux ports, this one going as far as to use Vulkan rather than older OpenGL. Both versions have full configuration files where you can remove shadows with a tweak in the video in the corner. Interestingly enough, the game reaches high performance on Windows, but on Linux it hits what looks like an unexpected CPU bottleneck. It is odd considering that the game was GPU bound on Windows. This might have to do with some of the changes done during the porting process, as Mad Max engine did not initially support Linux. Which is what I also decided to test Rocket League, a game using a real engine tree which supports exporting directly to Linux. While making accurate benchmarks of this guy can be hard, it does seem like the GPU's the main limiter in both versions, and the performance on a test map is pretty similar with a smaller impact. Which led me to Bioshock Infinite, another Unreal Engine 3 game natively ported to Linux with proper benchmarking tools that, when run, showed some old performance metrics on Linux. The GPU was the main bottleneck on the most intense parts, but overall the conclusion regarding the performance impact of the porting process is pretty similar to what I saw on the initial two games. Native games, initially, are made for Linux, so they represent the easiest to use, you just install and play, and should provide the best performance. In reality, in 3 of my test cases, the performance gap was dramatic. I am aware that there's a lot of lower level optimizations I could do since Linux is very customizable, but even that will hardly recover from an almost halving of the frame rate. Furthermore, from an industry level, Linux ports require the most effort. They require significant resources to create for what is currently a very small audience, which is why they're so rare in the AAA space. Most of the newest releases are indie titles. This is a good transition into part 2, W.I.N.E and Lutris. W.I.N.E is not an emulator. That is literally what the acronym means, it is recursive. W.I.N.E is a compatibility layer that translates certain parts of Windows, effectively allowing some Windows programs to run on Linux. It does not emulate an entire Windows PC. This program has evolved a great deal over the years, and it can successfully run a fair bit of games, with a lot of effort and configuration, which leads to the creation of a program like Lutris, a collection of scripts made for a large number of games that will pre-configure W.I.N.E for you to correctly play the game to the best it could be done. Usually it is lauded as a one-click solution, but in reality it often does not work, requires some other things to be installed, sometimes it does not open, and game updates break things. I stream my efforts of trying to understand how to get Skyrim and Overwatch working while having several people who knew way more about Linux than I do in the chat helping me out, and it took me 2 days of work to get Overwatch working without any input issues. The instructions made it clear that the cache needed to be filled and the game will stutter for a while, and boy did it stutter. But even after 5 or 6 matches playing like this, the performance was way too stuttery to work for me, and I never could get Skyrim to boot. Now I want to get something clear. With enough knowledge and a couple of days of work, you can probably get anything listed in Lutris to run, and the community effort that has gone into this tool is nothing short of admirable. But it is not the one-click tool that could bridge Linux as a more legitimate alternative to gaming OS. As it stands right now, it's complicated. Wouldn't it be cool if someone took this technology and this effort that is already there and transformed it into the next step in this natural evolution? Part 3, Steam Play. So it is pretty clear that Valve still considers Linux as the most likely candidate for the second horse in the gaming OS race, and has released the next step in their efforts, something less flashy than their own Linux distro or their own consoles, but likely something that is going to have a larger real impact. It's called Steam Play, and what they did is take the technology from W.I.N.E and DXPK, a transition layer that translates Microsoft-only DirectX into Linux-compatible Vulkan, to create their own fork called Proton, and integrate it directly into Steam. So to play a Windows-only game, you download the game on Steam, click play, and after a brief warning, it works. It just works. With some caveats, this was just released and the official compatibility list is a bit small, but you can try incompatible games if you're feeling bold. I'm getting ahead of myself again, let's try some games. The most impressive example here is Doom, a heavily optimized, bombastic, deliciously explosive game that is already compatible with Vulkan. I disable shadows with the trick on my video running on 720 and compare it with the same scene in Windows, and oh boy, well, there's an obvious performance impact. You are after all running this game on another OS using a compatibility layer. The impact during just regular gameplay is comparable and sometimes even less than what I saw with native ports. I did not have to struggle with a single white configuration file, it just worked. Another interesting case is Nier Automata, I often use this game as a GPU benchmark because of how stupidly computationally expensive its global illumination is, something that you can fix with the far mode, which, try as I might, I cannot get to work on Steam Play. We will get back to that. But even unmoded, compared to running it on regular Windows, the performance penalty is about 10 FPS, which is still playable on the GT 1030. Since this game is going through DirectX to Vulkan, rather than Vulkan to Vulkan like Doom, the heat is expected to be higher, but this is again compatible to the results that I saw in native ports. And here is why that is important. As I mentioned before, the native ports involve a substantial investment from publishers, and turns out they're not as performance perfect, at least in budget-oriented stuff, as promised. It might be wrong, but I don't think adding any of these games to Steam Play required a big involvement from the publishers of these games. Potentially, Valve could be adding real plug-and-play support to a variety of titles and slowly but surely extend the viability of Linux as a gaming OS. Ideally, a lot of people could be playing this without even knowing they're going through a compatibility layer. As a final experiment, you can go into the options and enable Steam Play for all games at your own risk of breaking things. Remember how I had so much trouble getting Lutris to do Skyrim? Not on Steam Play, here it just worked. People have been going through their libraries and documenting what works and what does not in Steam Play. Some links in the description. Look, everything is not perfect. Using the correct AMD drivers is still a daunting task, and the state of Intel HD drivers for gaming is really bad, which limits a large number of entry-level games and laptop users, not to mention that in certain cases like Nier Automata, the mods are Windows specific, so there's no simple way to install it on Linux. However, look at it this way, 10 years ago, just installing any distribution of Linux was complicated. 7 years ago, the idea of any mainstream gaming on Linux was hard to take seriously until Steam released Air, and by 2014 both Unity and Unreal Engine had added support to exporting their games to Linux. The initial release of the tool that translates DirectX to Vulkan was January this year, and it has only been months since Valve released their own fork that actually works flawlessly running a number of Windows games, with a performance impact in low-end PCs that rivals native. The progress on this thing has been exponential, and I will not be surprised if, in another 5 years, this whole thing is closer to being a true alternative to Windows. Not to mention that you can download Linux for free, so you don't have to spend money on a Windows license, which is a cost we never consider when we discuss the cost of PC gaming, and using Linux is way more secure than putting all your email passwords in a pirated OS that you got from who knows where. But all the Linux in the world is really not going to help you if you don't care about your security. Let me tell you a story that I have never shared on video before. In 2016, I went to Gamescom for the first time, the world's biggest gaming show. While on the show, my phone logged me out of Twitter, and I could not remember my password, so I changed it to the first thing that came to my mind and continued on with the show. What I did not know is that there had been a leak of the Social Blade database where I had used the same password, so a very dedicated hater used this to steal my Twitter account. This malicious individual, when I was still at the conference, set out to do as much damage as possible, posting many images of pornography and sending racial slurs to every person I had talked to during Gamescom. That was not good, and it took a lot of luck and help from some valiant people in the audience to get my account back. But since then, nothing of the sort has happened. Why? Because I use Dashlane. I use Dashlane to generate strong passwords for my vital stuff like YouTube and Twitter, which is locally encrypted with a master password and sync with my phone and the bazillion laptops that I use every day, and it alerts me when there's a major leak, so the Social Blade incident does not need to happen again. And the Pro version comes with some extra useful features, like a VPN that I use on my phone every time I have to use my PayPal or social media on Wi-Fi that I do not trust, and it supports Linux through its great web app and extension, so I can safely use it across operating systems as well. Don't be an idiot like me that uses the same password for your freaking social media and YouTube account on which your livelihood depends. You can use Dashlane for free on the link down below, or you can use the same link to support the channel and get 10% off Dashlane Premium, with unlimited passwords and devices, the VPN that I mentioned, and an even more impressive dark web monitoring system that alerts you when any of your passwords have been stolen and published on the seedier corners of the web. Thank you to them for sponsoring this video, and to these people for Patreon.